and we're following in the footsteps of a famous but relatively lesser-known English scientist from the 1600s. His name, well, you're going to learn his name here in a bit. Let me tell you a little bit more about him and what we're going to do today. This man was a really good experimentalist, and one of the things that he did that's very useful was he showed us how you can use the stretch of a spring, a simple coil of wire, to measure weights of objects. If you take the spring and hang something on it, it stretches down. And he discovered a simple relationship between those two variables, the weight and the stretch. So we're going to learn about how this process works, and I'd like to teach you a little bit about him. Now, you probably know one of the people who lived at the same time as this guy, Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton is famous. He invents the law of universal gravitation. He invents a branch of mathematics called calculus, related to taking the slopes of graphs the way we were doing on days 1, 2, and 3. And he's also important because he was one of the preeminent English scientists of his day. He did not get along particularly well with the man we're going to talk about today, and that person was Newton's nemesis. They did not get along. They were lifetime adversaries. When Newton was a young man, this English scientist, Robert Hooke, came upon him and accused him, Newton, of stealing some of Hooke's ideas. And Newton was so offended, and this acrimony between them continued over the years with accusations of ill will and misconduct that they never got along. So it's easy to have a bad opinion of Robert Hooke, but this guy is fascinating, and he is a fantastically good experimentalist. Now, before we talk about his experimental work, when you look at their photographs, you're seeing people at a very different point in fashion sense. Both of the men are wearing wigs. That's not their natural hair. And Newton on the right was considered to be very handsome, very prominent nose, strong jawline. Look at that wig. Hooke, on the other hand, has kind of a thin beaky nose. His eyes tended to bulge out, and he was widely considered to be a very unattractive man, which is not that important in the grand scheme of things if your contributions are scientific, but it was something that characterized the interaction between Newton and Hooke, that Newton always seemed to get the benefit of the doubt and people's good looks, and Hooke was often looked down on. And one of the things that ironically he was looked down on was his emphasis on doing experiments to the extent that he did, rather than focusing on the theory and the philosophy the way people like Newton did. Kind of a repeat of what we heard in Galileo's day. Now, you might wonder, what did Hooke do that was so good, Mr. Dowling? One of the things you may have already encountered in the Foundations section of the STT biology course, his work in microscopy. Hooke not only made his own microscope, in order to raise money, he made these fantastically detailed pictures that showed what you could see under a microscope, because most people didn't have access to one. Hooke, in addition to being a good craftsman and making his own microscope, grinding his own lenses, engraved the copper plates to produce pictures like this flea. This is a relatively small image of the flea that he published in a book of about 100 images that he sold to make money. You can see that different parts of the body are labeled with letters. The legs, for example, have H's and L's and R's on them, it looks like. Hooke was one of the first scientists to perform what we now call comparative biology, comparing and contrasting the sizes and shapes of different but corresponding parts of animal bodies. Another thing that he looked at, and this is the thing that you might have seen in Foundations, he was one of the first people to put something as simple as plant leaves and bark under the microscope. His picture of cork cells, for example, was one of the things that gave him a claim to fame. He named the cell. When he looked at bark from the cork tree under his microscope, what he saw was a series of uniform rows of little room-like structures that struck him as being similar to the cells of a monastery or a prison. When he looked for other arrangements of living matter, he kept finding the same thing, little room-like pockets, whether he looked at plants or animals. This was a key stepping stone to our modern theory that all living materials are composed of cells. Viruses, for example, they're not living. They're not made from cells. They're just a bit of DNA or RNA encapsulated inside of something, but it's not a proper cell, so they're not alive. You might wonder, well, what else did he do? Microscopes and pictures are pretty good. Anything else? Yeah. Robert Hooke was a skilled field geologist, and one of the things that he was also including in his book was engravings of strange stones that they would find in the low mountains of England. Now, England does not have very tall mountains, but it does have some, and at the top or around the tops of them, they would find these strange things that we would now recognize as fossils. At the time, the religious doctrine stated that the earth was in its form exactly as God had created it. And so when Hooke suggested, well, these creatures resemble undersea creatures with shells that we have found in places like the South Pacific, people were very reluctant to accept this idea that these life forms were no longer around, that they were extinct. And then when Hooke suggested that they were undersea creatures and implied that the mountain tops had once been under the surface of the water, there was even more resistance because it implied that the earth had been changing. Hooke was not afraid to face controversy. It didn't bother him that Newton didn't like him particularly much, and it didn't bother him that his ideas caused consternation, bafflement, and outrage among some members of society. He just kept stating what he saw, basing his conclusions on observations and experiments rather than what he thought should be true. Another thing that he was well known for was his work with clocks. He invented a key improvement to the grandfather clock called the anchor escapement that you can see on the left-hand side there. Made it much more accurate, and he realized that pendulums were not the only way of keeping time. You could also keep time with something like a spring, bouncing up and down, or if you make one in the shape of a spiral, as you see on the right-hand side, bouncing back and forth in a circular way. Hooke was interested in this because, as a seafaring nation, the English were quite interested in having accurate ways to determine how far to the east or to the west you are in the globe, your longitude. And one of the best ways to do that, one of the simplest ways, is to use a clock. You may have noticed if you've ever flown westward on our own country, to Texas or Oklahoma, or maybe over to California, that there are different time zones. And this idea that the time naturally seems to change because it's noon at different times in an absolute sense in different parts of the globe means that you can measure how far you are east or west, your longitude, if you have a very accurate clock on your ship that can keep and maintain the time in jolly old England, and you can compare when noon in England is with the noon that you observe at your current position just by looking overhead on your ship out in the South Pacific, for example. Newton invented the concept of calculus, but Hooke invented the concept of the spring-driven clock. So one of these historical figures is well known for his theoretical work, and one of them is very well known for his experimental and his mechanical inventions and work. So we're going to focus on Hooke's contributions today. Now, his observations about springs are based on a very simple experiment. Normally, if we were in person, you and your classmates would have a chance to do this experiment. And the idea is you have a single spring, and you hang different weights on it. And you see how does the weight pulling down relate to the stretch of the spring. The pattern that Hooke discovered was quite simple. It's called a direct proportion. In words, a direct proportion is very simple. The idea that with no weight, the spring is not stretched at all can be expressed like this: none of this, none of that. If we then compare the stretch that we get for one weight versus two, you can see that doubling the weight will cause the stretch to double. And verbally, you can say this as double this, double that. So direct proportions always follow this pattern. A value of 0 in one variable causes a value of 0 in the other. Doubling one doubles the other. And the way I say that is none of this, none of that, double this, double that. Makes it easy to remember. Graphically, if you plot this out, you will always get a perfectly straight line right to the origin. The origin is that none of this, none of that point, so it has to go through there. And the double this, double that means that it must make a straight line. Straight lines to the origin mean that points on them follow a particularly simple mathematical rule. When you have a line to the origin, as long as you pick a point that is not the origin, you're not allowed to divide 0 by 0. Mathematically, any other point on the line will have a constant ratio. Because the weight doubles and the stretch doubles, or if the weight triples, the stretch triples, or if the weight quadruples, the stretch quadruples, the ratio of those two values is always the same. I would like you to check that in your experiment today, which will rely on a simulation. Had we had the opportunity to do it with real springs, we get phenomenally excellent results that match what Hooke found almost 350 years ago. Now, in our experiment, what we're going to be looking at is a method of measuring unknown weights, and it relies on this idea of the constant ratio. If I have an object hanging from a spring, I can make a scale that indicates how much the stretch has become, and if I use experimental data to relate that stretch back to the weights, I have a way of getting at the weight of unknown objects. What we'll do is set up a known weight and a known stretch with an unknown weight and a stretch that we observe. If we set those two equal ratios equal to each other, we can use the method of cross multiplication to solve for the unknown weight W2, for example. So we'd like to try that after we've had a chance to do the experiment. In this simulation, we're going to be taking data using the values on the screen, and afterwards I'd like you to try with a video of a much simpler type of spring that I'll have to video at home, using this technique to determine the weight of an unknown object. The simulation uses units that are metric, and some of you may not be that familiar with the metric unit of weight, which is called, in honor of Isaac Newton, the Newton. We in America measure our weights in things like pounds. You stand on a scale, it reads 160, you know that it's 160 pounds. The metric unit that corresponds to the pound is not the kilogram, it's the Newton. And the question is, well, how big is it? A pretty useful rule of thumb I call the McDonald's rule, after the famous restaurant, McDonald's. McDonald's is an interesting story. The McDonald brothers who started it were not particularly good businessmen. They came up with a fantastic model for a restaurant, but they didn't really spread it around. They only had one operation. And back in the 1950s, this guy, Ray Kroc, stumbled upon it. Ray Kroc is the American businessman who is credited with inventing the franchise model. He buys the restaurant, buys the rights to their name, and what he does is he spreads the restaurant around to all other parts of the country by using exactly the same menu, the same design, and the same look and feel. So if you walk into a McDonald's in Atlanta or Denver or Houston or even Tokyo, you're likely to get something very familiar. Now, I like to tell the story this way. Ray Kroc is a big science fan, and he wants to have something on the menu that honors his scientific hero, Isaac Newton. So he comes up with something he calls the Newton burger. The uncooked weight of a patty, 1 Newton. But when people walk into the restaurant, they take a look at that name, they have no idea what it is, and they're like, there's no way I'm buying that. And Ray Kroc is a businessman. He can't keep something on the menu that doesn't sell. So what he does is change the name of the Newton burger to the equivalent or almost the equivalent weight in American pounds. And it is now known, folks, as the Quarter Pounder.